You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Biodiversity. It's what keeps the planet in balance. In the simplest terms, it's the variety of plants and animals around the world. Systematically, biodiversity keeps the climate in check, it makes sure ecosystems are functioning, gives us food security, economic benefits, and supports human existence. So what of the overarching goals that we have to ensure biodiversity can be protected and prosper? There's a global summit for that. This week, we're going to the heart of Colombia to unpack COP16. Hi, and welcome to Climate Conversations. I'm Jack Board. Hello, Leading Tan. How's it going?
Hi, Jack. It's going well. I'm kind of laughing over what you said just now. There is a summit for that.
There's a summit for that. There's a summit for that.
There's an app for that.
There's a reason to travel far distances to talk about that. Ever made it over to Colombia or South America in your time?
No. Well, closest I've been to is Cuba. I've been to Cuba, but that's it. Not really counted.
Central America?
Yeah, not close. That's the closest I've been to South America. So, and I think Cuba gives me some street cred. So there you go.
Yeah, sure, it does.
What about you, Jack? Have you been to Bogota, Colombia, or anywhere in South America?
Use your interviewing skills. This is a conversation. No, I have not been there. I have been to South America. I've been to Argentina, Chile, and Brazil a couple of times on assignment for CNA. Maybe we'll go there together next year. Who knows? COP30 in Brazil.
Yes! I hope so. Let's try and do that. That'll be so exciting.
Okay, quiz time. Talking all things biodiversity. Liling, can you tell me the top 3 most diverse countries in the world? Now, this is based on an index made by Mongabay. It's basically using groups of animals. So amphibians, birds, fish, mammals, reptiles, and then plants as well.
Okay, so basically everything.
Not everything.
Except humans.
It's not everything. There's other things.
Animals, fish, mammals, reptiles, plants, amphibians, birds. So not insects.
Correct. There are some other asterisks as well.
Okay.
Not all types of plants either, but it doesn't include invertebrates, fungi, microorganisms, and a number of other types.
This just gives you an idea of how complex biodiversity is.
Super complicated, yes.
Nuts. All right, I'm going to have to do an educated guess. I feel like I kind of can roughly identify which countries, but let me chew on it for a little bit.
Sounds good. Answers at the end. Okay, news time. Liling, take us through some stories that you found this week.
So, in the vein of being completely positive, as we have been over the past 2 weeks.
We have been so positive.
Do you note the optimism in my voice?
I can hear it.
I'm going to start with some good news this week. So, the Philippines has seen clean energy startups jump a staggering 6-fold since 2020, and that's according to a recent report from New Energy Nexus, an international clean energy nonprofit. So currently, the country has about 91 startups in the clean energy and climate space, and that's compared with 15 just 4 years ago. So that's 6 times as many, just about. Slightly more than a third are in metropolitan Manila, and the rest are more or less split between Calabar Zone and northern Mindanao in the south. Now, nearly half are in renewable energy, and the rest range from clean transportation to waste management. But, and there's always a but, right? But the study also pointed out that the support system for these entrepreneurs need to catch up. So the startup space is still lacking, needed and sufficient access to networks, to funding, to testing facilities, as well as training. And without this, experts are saying the growth could lose momentum. For example, the space could do with more support from the public sector by way of policies, and also from the private sector through investments, for instance.
Yeah, I read this story on Eco Business in the last few days. I think it's really cool to see that there are so many startups happening in that space. And not all of them are in Manila. So interesting trend. And yeah, hopefully the money can follow.
Yeah, I think it also really kind of underscores some of the complexities in actually delivering on a lot of these support for renewable energy, right? Because a lot of it requires the system in place, the networks in place to actually, support this emerging sector, and very often there just aren't enough of it.
But Filipinos, full of good ideas, always.
Next up, also good news from the climate perspective. Great Britain has shut down its last coal plant. Woohoo!
Sorry, that was a bit. We were activists there.
Yeah. Okay. So no woohoo, but chalk it as a win for the climate fight. So the Ratcliffe-on-Soar plant in central England closed on September 30th, ending 142 years of coal-fired electricity in a nation where the Industrial Revolution began. Coal-powered steam engines fed demand for metals and minerals, and that gave rise to mighty industries, for those of you who need a little bit of the history lesson. So the UK was the first country to actually lock in a deadline to phase out coal power by 2025. It's part of a bolder plan to transition the country to renewable power by 2030. And it is among the first countries in the world to phase out coal. So this made me wonder how many active coal plants are left in the world. Jack, can you make a guess, wild guess?
How many active coal plants?
Yeah, roughly.
I mean, some are shutting down, but not that many. I think that the UK would be a rare story of a country really cutting out all of its coal. China still has new coal. Indonesia has quite a lot still going on. I've got no idea. Plants? 1,000.
Not quite. As of July this year, there were more than 2,400 active operating coal plants, and that's according to Statista. But, the good news is it's been decreasing since 2021 as countries phase it out. And you mentioned China. I think China accounts for nearly half of that figure.
The writing is on the wall for coal, that's for sure. It is on the way
Sunset
out.
industry.
Yeah, the economic fundamentals are just not there anymore. But, yeah, countries like China still need it to power their economy. So, yeah, it'll take a few decades. All right, it's time for our main story this week. We tend to talk about one of the major COPs quite often. The Conference of the Parties, that's what COP stands for, that focuses on climate change. That has delivered us the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement. There's another COP that collectively I feel gets a little bit overlooked. Outside of those who are intimately following the proceedings or involved with it, that is the COP on biodiversity. And it's happening soon in just over a week. COP 16 is being hosted in the city of Cali in Colombia. Plenty of heads of states, ministers from across the world, traveling there to attend. Now, while it's happening in South America, what's discussed there actually matters for the whole world. And there's plenty on the table. In short, there are lots of concerns about a biodiversity crisis happening across the globe. One key goal is advancing the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, this is a big deal. It's kind of compared to the Paris Agreement in terms of its scope. Liling, want to give us the lowdown on exactly what that mouthful of a framework is?
I thought you'd never ask. All right. So the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is a landmark agreement reached by 196 countries back in 2022 at COP15. It's been called the Paris Agreement for Nature, and its purpose is to stop and reverse biodiversity loss. So it's a huge, huge deal. Now, it has 4 key goals to guide global efforts to conserve biodiversity by 2050. And they include ways to protect and expand natural ecosystems and stop species extinction caused by us, humans. And it wants to do this by reducing the risk of extinction by tenfold. And that's just the first of the 4 goals. The others involve the sustainable use of biodiversity and natural resources and the fair sharing and usage of genetic resources, for example, when it comes to indigenous people and local communities, such as the use of intellectual property laws to protect traditional knowledge around, say, for instance, the medicinal use of plants found in local communities, right?
It's interesting.
Yeah. Now, there are also goals around scientific knowledge sharing and technology transfers, and especially around financing, particularly for developing countries and small island developing states.
Right. And they've got a checklist of things that they want to accomplish, right? A lot of targets.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us all of the targets?
No, I do not. I won't go through all the 23, but I will tell you some of the key targets. And one of them is to bring the loss of areas with high concentrated biodiversity to zero. So bring that loss to zero and also restore what's already been degraded. So there are also rules to conserve and manage land and water bodies, as well as target invasive species and also reduce pollution. So to do all this, money is a big factor. So one of the major targets is to mobilize at least 200 billion US dollars a year from public and private sources by 2030. Now, what's really important, Jack, is that, and you know this as well as a lot of us who watch this biodiversity space, is that this agreement or this framework is quite unprecedented. And it comes as we are undergoing an extinction event right now due to human activities, right? A scale of biodiversity loss known as the Holocene extinction, which is the sixth mass extinction event in the history of the Earth. And it's happening right now.
Yep, it is. I thought you were bringing only good news this week. And you've just brought up the extinction.
I went back to factory settings.
A little reset button's been pressed somewhere. But that is a great introduction to what we're talking about here. It is a globally significant event for the future of the planet. These discussions really matter. And I think what's also fascinating about this COP is the location. And Colombia is one of the most dangerous places in the world for environmental defenders and journalists, the very people who are standing up for biodiversity or informing our knowledge of what's going on. So lots of intersecting interests that happen in a place like Colombia. So let's explore that more. We're joined now by journalist Oliver Griffin from Thomson Reuters. He reports on environmental and energy issues from his HQ in Bogota, Colombia.
Thank you for having me.
Now, it's been a while since the biodiversity COP landed in South America. I'm sure you weren't there the last time it was in Brazil about 20 years ago. But what does it mean actually to have such significant talks on the continent coming up?
No, I definitely wasn't there last time. But, I wouldn't say that I could necessarily speak for the continent, but it's clearly a huge deal for Colombia and Cali. It's been quite noticeable, the excitement being felt across the country and also especially by the team in the environment ministry. In a lot of their kind of press conferences, you can really tell they're really gearing up for it and they want it to be a huge success. We're expecting scores of government delegations, around a dozen heads of state and government leaders to come and join the proceedings in COP16. So it's definitely something that they've put a lot of work into, and there's a lot of excitement about what that might mean for the country more broadly in terms of the top environmental issues of the day.
You cover Colombia and the broader northern South American region, and this is a region that's a really critical hotspot for many of the issues around biodiversity and biodiversity preservation. Can you talk us through what this part of the world is like in terms of environmental reporting?
I think first and foremost, there's lots of really good environmental reporting in the region. There's a lot of very talented Colombian reporters, international reporters, covering things from, say, across, let's call it the Spanish fringe of the Amazon, the part of the northern bit of the rainforest, which is predominantly Spanish speaking. A lot of the issues to do with, most recently, are ones that you see they come out of Brazil, to do with issues with droughts, issues with forest fires, the usual kind of stuff. But I think as well, what a lot of people can forget is that unlike, say, Brazil, where obviously the vast majority of the Amazon is, we also have a lot of kind of different ecosystems to be reporting on across, say, the whole range of different altitudes that are in countries like Colombia and Ecuador. Bogota is at 2,800 meters, I think, which obviously means that that's a starkly different environment to what you might see in the rainforest or in the Caribbean region. So there's a lot of different kind of topics to be covering in the environment. And I think another issue that we can't really forget is that there are certainly dangers to environmental reporting in this kind of region. Not that I feel that I've suffered from that myself, but we can't forget in neighboring Brazil, the murder of Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira in 2022. So it's certainly not without its risks either.
You mentioned the aspects of safety for journalists and We often talk about environmental defenders in this region, many threats being faced by people who are standing on the front line for their community and for biodiversity. Do you think that COP16 will illuminate that issue, the level of threats being faced by environmental defenders?
I think there is a hope that COP16 will address that issue. I think Colombia in particular is a very interesting country to hold the COP so soon after the Global Witness report came out earlier this year. Colombia was once again, according to Global Witness, the world's most dangerous country for environmentalists. It's not the first time or even the second time, I think, in the 5 years that I've been here that has been the case. Latin America in particular, going back to what does this mean for the continent? Latin America is far and away the leader in terms of how environmentalists are treated poorly and killed for their work. We've done a lot of stories on this from Reuters Bogota, and I think there are definitely activists that hope that this is their opportunity to speak up and get an audience for the issues that they really face. It's something we continue to see this year. It's a real issue that environmentalists continue to face, especially in Colombia, but also obviously in those other neighboring countries as well. I think it will be interesting to see if COP16 is able to shine a light on that. It's one thing. I think sometimes it's easy to forget the humans that are on the front lines of conservation. And I think that hopefully this COP will be an opportunity for them to put forward their position and get some attention for what they're trying to draw attention to.
What is the source of the danger for these environmental defenders in Colombia specifically?
According to the government and security sources, most of the danger comes from illegal armed groups operating in the country and drug traffickers that maybe feel that their activities, particularly in gold mining or tree felling, are being threatened by people that are resisting those activities or getting in the way of their own economic gain. They would be the chief ones. I think in our story in 2021, that was essentially what our sources told us was the case and the people most likely behind environmentalist killings in the country. Obviously, Colombia reached a peace agreement with the FARC in 2016, but that is by no means the end of the country's internal armed conflict. There are still other groups active in the country, and so those are the people that security sources and other members of the government would say are threatening, particularly environmental activists and environmentalists throughout the country.
You really rarely think about environmental work being something that involves a conflict zone. So this is really illuminating for us to hear.
Yeah, super interesting part of the world to be doing environmental reporting. Let's turn to COP16 a little bit. What are you going to be looking out for, and how do you think it might impact some of the reporting that you and your team are doing regularly?
Yeah, so as someone that reports on kind of twin beats of energy and the environment, and we often, cover crossovers of those two different beats. So, for example, we did a story on oil theft and how that affects the environment and ecosystems in the Colombian Pacific jungle. I'm also going to be looking for synergies between the climate COP, made famous by the Paris Climate Agreement, and also this biodiversity COP. We've spoken to a few people that have really hammered home how without protecting nature, these experts say we can't necessarily guarantee, or we won't guarantee, success in dealing with the climate challenges either. So it's going to be really interesting for me personally how those two could potentially work together, especially with the next climate COP coming up in around, I think, the end of the month. And then obviously COP30, which is the one that people are already talking about for next year.
A lot of the issues around biodiversity now, how it's about trying to manage and maintain or restore species loss. Now, where you are, you kind of get a first-hand witness account of the impact that human activity is having on the environment and on biodiversity. What for you has been the most gutting thing that you have witnessed or reported on out of there?
I think one of the most kind of surprising things I'd ever seen in person was deforestation and burning trees that had been felled in Caquetá around, I think that was 2021 when we went down to look at how illegal roads impact the Amazon and what they call the agricultural frontier. So that's where people are moving into the rainforest from the Colombian side of things. And it's one thing to see that on TV and to see photos of it, and that's obviously devastating. I think it's another thing entirely to have your eyes sting from the smoke and be able to smell that kind of burning and see flames spring up from the side of a road that your guide is telling you wasn't even there until maybe a few weeks ago or months ago. So I think seeing, deforestation in real time was absolutely the most surprising thing I've ever seen.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it? Just, you talked about being surprised. I lived in California for a while, and there were a lot of wildfires there, and some of them came so close to the highways, you'd be just driving down the highway, and then there's right next to you, it's like this massive amount of smoke and fire happening, but everything else is just going on. Traffic is moving. It's just so bizarre. There's this huge dissonance when it comes to that kind of thing. And it's probably a fraction of what you were experiencing when you saw all that unfolding right there. But I can't imagine.
It was very weird having it juxtaposed by having seen, I don't know which species, but a monkey, the first time I'd ever seen a monkey in the wild climbing through trees just a few short hours, either earlier or later, I can't remember the exact chronology, or this beautiful kind of toucan. And after seeing that and then being so close to nature in positive ways, and then seeing nature impacted so negatively so soon afterwards, it was very jarring to be in those two situations so close together.
We've spoken in recent weeks about the extent of fires across South America. Has that been something that you've had to observe or report about, or is it something that will be in the minds of those negotiating at COP16 as well? Presumably, if you've 60% of the continent covered in smoke, I think we were talking about a few weeks ago.
Yeah, obviously there's a huge story, and Colombia has not been without its own share of fires either recently or earlier in the year. I think the underlying story about that is around the scarce rainfall that we've seen, particularly in, say, Colombia and Ecuador, in Bogota, a city that when I moved to it in 2019 was famous for being wet. But I was advised to bring an umbrella, waterproof, which is not your usual kit, which you recommend when you move to South America, right? Especially from the UK. It's not normal that someone is advising you when you're moving from Brit to bring wet weather clothes. Exactly. But that was the case. And this year, Bogota has had water rationing. Ecuador has had to implement a series of power cuts to ration water in their own kind of, for use in their own hydroelectric dams. And these are traditionally very wet places. And people, experts and scientists we've spoken to have squarely put that on climate change and the El Nino phenomenon that was exacerbated by climate change. And it does feel like we were just saying earlier with the flames that we saw with deforestation in real time. It really does feel that you can see climate change happening around you with the way that people are commenting on different weather phenomena. That stuff isn't quite right.
Have you reported much about the finances towards developing countries and small and developing states in terms of managing their biodiversity loss?
Colombia's government, since coming in 2022, has pushed very hard for money or financing or debt forgiveness for, let's say, nature services, looking after nature in the country. I know it's a contentious issue that's still being negotiated, and you sometimes see these breakthroughs with multilateral loans or kind of agreements between countries. But what I think we do know is that there is a shortfall in how much money has been promised and how much organizers, other countries with all the nature say is needed to help them protect that. So I'm sure that will be a key issue. But I think one thing that's clear from the people we've spoken to is that this COP is seen very much as an implementation COP. So it's about how things are going and how things are progressing. Those are the kind of the key issues that people are expecting to see come up and check in on how everything is working out. So I don't know to what extent we can expect big announcements with lots of glitter and stuff, but I think we'll have to wait and see how they get on in the 2 weeks that go in from around the end of October.
I want glitter. I want to see some glitter, actually.
Glitter is always good. I'm always for glitter.
I wonder if there's a biodiversity-friendly version of glitter.
Yeah.
I can imagine someone messing that up and sending plastic out into the rainforest inadvertently.
There were pledges at the last COP15 to mobilize at least $200 billion a year from public and private sources and $30 billion a year for low-income countries, all by 2030.
Soon. That's soon.
Yeah, that's not very far away. Are you expecting to hear any updates, any progress updates on that?
It reminds me a lot of the climate COPs where we hear about these huge amounts of finance that are being promised, that are being pledged, But nobody can say how much is going to be announced. Nobody can say how much is actually being mobilized. It's all in this convoluted multilateral system.
It is.
And I can see the mirroring of these frustrating processes in the climate COP actually playing out in the biodiversity COP too.
Yeah. When I was at the UN, we would spend just a whole day just trying to sift through all the noise just to get one spreadsheet about which country is donating how much, when to expect it. It is just, there's so many layers just to get to that information. And in this pursuit of transparency, you'd think that they make it a lot easier.
What's your strategy, Ollie, to finding that out and letting us all know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to rely on more talented, better colleagues than myself. But we'll do the usual checking with our sources and hopefully staying on top of any announcements as they come out, or even better, just before they come out, to bring that to you. But I think it's obviously a very kind of, I do feel that maybe topics that might seem easy to understand, like plants and animals, are actually clearly incredibly complicated. The funding for them as well. And so it's never straightforward with how this kind of, what these different announcements mean, or what the various funding means. So we'll obviously wait with bated breath to see how that comes out and how that develops over the COP16.
All right. Wish you all the best. We'll be keeping an eye on your reporting and we'll hopefully see you for COP30 in Brazil.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, quiz time. Liling, repeating the question for you. Can you tell me the top 3 most diverse countries in the world?
Okay, so the first one, I feel it's very obvious, right? We're talking about, countries that have the most biodiverse animals, creatures. So they have to be big and very likely near the equator, right? To sustain that kind of a population. And we kind of have heard quite a bit about this country. So I'm going to go with Brazil at number 1.
Correct.
Woohoo!
Brazil is number 1.
Okay, I think I know what the next 2 are. They're not quite as obvious. Well, one of them might be quite obvious, but they're not quite as obvious. I just don't know which comes before the other. So I know Indonesia has to be the other one. And I'm going to go with China. So Brazil, I think Indonesia. All right, so China.
China
No?
is correct. 3 from 3.
Oh my God, I was kind of leaning towards Australia, but I don't think Australia is that far up
Australia
on
is
this
number
because
7.
of the outbacks.
Number 7 on the list, Australia. And Colombia, the country we've been talking about, is number 4.
No way. Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
People are going to think this is a conspiracy now that you're just getting all of these correct every week.
No, I did pretty badly last week. I got the one with Catherine Hayhoe correct.
That's
but
true.
last week, I think I only got one country out of 4, right? I can't remember what it was, but I totally crashed and burned last week. So,
You didn't this week. You've
not
come
this
through
week.
with flying colours.
But this week was quite easy. I think this one was quite obvious. Thank you.
All right, that's it for Climate Conversations. Thanks as always for joining us. We'll be back next week.
Until then, I'm Liling Tan. Bye-bye for now.
And I'm Jack Board. Thanks as always to the team that put together this podcast: Tiffany Ang, Janani Jahari, Crispina Robert, and Sai Yewin.